That's good. More and more people are trickling in. Numbers are growing. All right. Good morning, good day, good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure to welcome all of you to this day's webinar. Today with two exciting guests. And they have recently published a very great book together. It's not their first book, individually speaking, but that's what we're going to talk about. You might not be able to see it, but it's about the 10 global trends every person, every smart person should know. So you being here at this very webinar will ensure that you will be smarter afterwards by just listening to these great individuals. And I'm very glad to welcome Ronald Bailey. And one is a very accomplished writer who has been writing for many years for Reason magazine, reason.com. And he also has a weekly science technology policy column all over there. And he has written also very interesting books, one of them being The End of Doom, Environmental Renewal in the 21st Century, and also a book about the liberation biology, the scientific and moral case for the biotech revolution. So Ron is very knowledgeable about technology and also about human progress, which brings me to Marian. Dr. Tupy is the editor of humanprogress.org. If you don't know that website, it should be part of your bookmarks. Same as with Reason magazine, reason.com, Human Progress should be part of your bookmarks. Because every day when we look at the news, we're getting more and more depressed. And it is unfortunate to see all of that. And it feels like that the world, how do the Americans say, goes to hell in a handbasket. But that's not the case. And that's what both Ron and Marian talk about. And Marian is also in charge of the Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity and co-author of the Simon Project, which of course goes to Julian Simon, a fantastic author. And Dr. Tupy specializes in globalization and global well-being. And both Ron and Dr. Tupy have been, or like Marian, have been published in many different outlets. New York Times, Wall Street Journal, BBC, CNN. The credentials are plentiful. With that being said, I just want to say hi. My name is Dr. Wolf von Laer, and I'm the CEO of Students for Liberty, representing an organization that has students all across the world who are organizing events and trainings to educate classical liberal students. So much so that last year our students have organized in a single year 2,700 events with over 120,000 people. And just this morning, I had the fortune to talk to some of our South Asian students, and I talked to one of our students who actually organized events in Afghanistan, and he told me he has 120 classical liberals now working in Afghanistan to push for the same ideas that we will be talking about here today. With that, all of the intro out of the way, Ron, Marian, how do you do today?
Doing very well. Thank you for having us.
And thank you very much for having me. I'm just going to make one small correction. I'm not in charge of the Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity. I am a senior fellow there. But aside from that, delighted to be with you all.
Then you should be in charge. No. Well, thank you for that correction. Thank you for that correction and for all of your work. So let us jump in. So you're writing a book. I'll show it again. It's beautiful. And it has a lot of data in there, but it's very easy to digest. But it makes the case that we human beings, we should be like much more optimistic about the future. You must be both very brave individuals right now, aren't you? Because if you look at the world, we see Australia recently was on fire. COVID is ravaging the world. Economic crises, debt levels beyond anything that we would have expected earlier in 2020. We have a highly contentious election coming here in the United States. There are authoritarians from both the left and the right everywhere. Why are you still optimistic?
Well, if I may start, I would like to push back slightly against the idea that our book is optimistic. What we're trying to do is to provide uncontroversial mainstream data about the long-term trends that humanity has had over the last 2 centuries or so. And it's just realism from our point of view. We're trying to get people to understand the real state of the world. The problem is that very smart people are obviously aware of the negative trends. They pay attention to the news, they think about how to solve problems and so forth. But what we're trying to do is to give them the context that they don't think about, of how far we've come and the institutions that underpinned how far we've come. So I don't think of it as optimism so much, other than the fact that, in fact, the world has been getting a lot better than most people tend to think. And that is what this book is trying to demonstrate. One of the catchphrases we use is you can't fix the world unless you know how the world is. And that's what we're trying to do.
I would only add to that human progress, the very idea of human progress, is essentially a retrospective take on humanity's past. And what we have done was to identify a number of trends, 78 trends in all, that have improved over decades, over centuries, and sometimes over millennia. And what that points to, this massive amount of human progress that has taken place, is that humanity is able to adapt, it is able to innovate, it is able to solve problems as they arise. It doesn't mean that there are no challenges ahead. It doesn't mean that we cannot have reversals. But the question we are asking is why, if humanity has managed to improve things in the past so often, should we stop doing that now? Right. So instead of setting our hair on fire and saying, my God, there are problems already in the world and there are more challenges ahead, what we are saying is, if you read this book, you are going to be infused with rational optimism about people's ability to solve problems. And there's no reason to expect that all of that problem-solving intelligence of the past is just going to stop, and that we are going to simply not be able to solve our problems and adapt in the future.
I like that. And it's really, as you've said, it's more realistic than optimistic. But looking at the data, even if it's backward looking, it does make, at least for me as the reader, a strong case to be optimistic. So right now, in the light of everything that's going on, are you personally optimistic about the future of humankind? Ron?
Absolutely. So long as we maintain the institutions that have created the kind of world that we describe in the book. I mean, we point out, for example, in the first chapter, the Great Enrichment. What happened over the last 2 centuries is that world GDP increased 100-fold. That is an amazing accomplishment. Prior to that, humanity mostly dwelled in their natural state of abject, ignorant, violent poverty. So there was something that changed around 2 centuries ago, and we'll call that the Enlightenment and the creation of liberal institutions that unleashed the ability for human beings to make all the progress that we document. And of course, if those institutions go away, then we may have a problem in the future. But we also look in the book showing that those institutions have been expanding over the last decades or so. And there are some reversals, but I suspect that they will continue to do so as the 21st century unfolds. And we can expect, because of basically classical liberalism, greater prosperity and freedom for more and more people across the globe by the end of the century.
So what institutions are you referring to when you said that those are the very fabric that made all of these great progress possible?
I tend to use a quick framework that Jonathan Rauch outlined in his fabulous book, Kindly Inquisitors, some years ago. They're the Enlightenment institutions. They're basically democracy, how we decide who gets legitimate power and how to change them as well. Capitalism, which is how we decide who gets what, and who gets rewarded for their innovations and so forth. And then critically for me, the most important one is one he calls liberal science. And by liberal science, he means the ability to criticize, everybody gets to criticize everybody else. There's no one who has access to transcendent truth at all. And this is basically radical free speech all the way down, from the worst political pamphlet to peer-reviewed science. Everybody gets to criticize everybody else. And if you have those 3, if you will, pillars for classical liberalism, then human progress is inevitable.
I like that. But Marian, what about you? Are you optimistic then as well?
We live in a world with unprecedented peace and decline of violence, unprecedented lifespans, the best healthcare and medical technology that humanity has ever experienced. We have more access to food Greater part of humanity lives under some form of representative government than ever before. Women can vote anywhere in the world except for the Vatican. It would be quite ungrateful not to be optimistic or at least to be severely depressed about the state of the world, given how well we are doing compared to our ancestors. I mean, if we are going to depress, how should our grandparents and their parents feel about it?
Gratitude is something that is very hard to learn, and I think we need more of that. But right now, if you look around us, it feels like the world is on fire constantly. So in your opinion, why do you think that, probably it's fair to say that most people have like a negative attitude towards the future? Why do you think that is?
Well, if I would like to throw the question to Marian in this way, because he made in conversation with me, he made a fabulous point with regard to if COVID had happened 25 years ago, where would we be now?
Well, fundamentally, the problem 25 years ago would have been that our ability to analyze the virus and then to cooperate internationally to come up with solutions to the pandemic would have been severely retarded. The Chinese have discovered what they called pneumonia in December of 2019, hence the name COVID-19. By the middle of January, we knew that we were facing a new virus, and I believe that by the end of January, we had samples of the virus, which we were then able to genetically decode over a period of a couple of days, and then via email and cloud and whatever else, that information about the genetic structure of this virus was shared around the world in nanoseconds, thus giving healthcare specialists in 200 countries around the world the ability to start searching for tests for weaknesses of this virus and started coming up with ways to address it. One of the remarkable things that I have read, may have been from Ron, and Ron will be able to tell more about it, is that by being able to look at the genetic structure of the virus and then plugging that information into supercomputer, you can start matching that genetic code with the molecular structure of existing medicines and start seeing which of these existing medical treatments are the best candidates in practice to arrest the spread of the virus. And this is something that wouldn't have been done before. I mean, before you probably would have had the virus living in some sort of a petri dish, and then people in lab coats going around and individually trying to mix it with different chemicals and seeing what happens. Now everything is done virtually. So all of these things are remarkable, leading to the conclusion that we are probably going to have a virus vaccine by the end of the year, in 12 months. That has never been done before in human history.
Right. In other words, 2 decades, 3 decades ago, had this happened, we would still be waiting for the waves to crash over us, and possibly many millions of more people would have died by now if that had occurred. This much progress in biotechnology and medicine and so forth has, it's not great, but it could have been so much worse because all of the progress that we've seen in medicine and in economics and communication and what have you. And as Marian pointed out, having a vaccine in less than a year is an amazing accomplishment. I'll be bold. I will. Okay.
Just one last thing, and that is that, of course, in addition to one very important part of that information sharing is that is when people on one side of the world realize that having patients lie on their tummy as opposed to on their back, exactly, or giving them or applying the ventilator too soon, these sorts of things can be also spread much more quickly, and therefore we don't have to learn from our own mistakes. We can appreciate the mistakes of others and try to prevent them from and not repeat them.
My hope and my expectation is that after this episode is over, that the world will have created a if you will, a disease surveillance system that will give us a lot of warning ahead of time in the future, and that we'll have developed the techniques that will basically make it almost, that will basically, this may be the last pandemic.
You heard it here first, folks. The last pandemic, COVID-19. I like that one. And those are really fantastic insights and make me excited about the future. I mean, there's still a lot of suffering happening, but there's also a lot of hope. But that's not what most people feel these days. And that's not most people, how they see the world around them. I don't think that there's a lot of hope in the world. Why do you think that is the case? That we're tackling so much skepticism?
Who do you want to start?
Marian, you go, take it ahead. Human progress.
Well, there are a number of aspects to the human negativity bias. One of them is that bad news is prioritized for obvious evolutionary reasons. If you were just walking around always expecting good things to happen, you probably didn't make it very far in an environment which was much more inhospitable to human beings than it is today. Also, people get constantly bombarded by the news, and the news is about things which happens rather than things that don't happen. So we know that there's a conflict going on in between Azerbaijan and Armenia, but you know there are 200 other countries in the world which are not currently at war, but that doesn't make the news because those wars didn't take place. Also, very often newspapers and television don't give us the long-term trends, which is to say that if it comes to, for example, things like murder rates, which are certainly on the increase in the United States, homicide rates, yes, they are on the increase from the year before, but they are still very much down from the mid-1990s. But because the newspapers usually reflect on year-on-year changes rather than decade-long changes, we don't get a sense of how much the world has improved. Bad is stronger than good. We are afraid of losses rather than we appreciate gains. So that's another problem. And we think relatively rather than absolutely. So we compare ourselves to the people in our own social setting rather than appreciate how much better off we are relative to the rest of humanity, or for that matter, relative to our ancestors. So every time that Ron gets a raise and additional days of holidays to spend in the Caribbean, I get very jealous because that actually reduces my own happiness rather than increasing it.
Well, one other than the fact that I haven't been able to go to the Caribbean all year, putting that aside for the moment, one other simple way I think about it is that progress takes a long time to happen and nobody notices. It's imperceptible. So it takes a long time to build a house, but it takes an hour for a fire to burn it down. The news is the fire, not the fact that the houses got built and that millions of houses don't burn down. And so people, again, as Marian points out, focus on the negative. And that misleads them. And that's what we're trying to correct with this book is think in a larger picture. If you really want to know the state of the world, step back from the news. There are problems out there, but take a much longer look. And I think that most people coming away from the book will feel a lot better.
Wonderful. I mean, that's great. And it definitely is worthwhile for our audience to look in some of these psychological, how do I say that, concepts like negativity bias or availability bias, because if you see bad news and you see more bad news, then you put it together, but you really, you don't see like the very much the whole and the trends and how it looked like a decade ago, is what you said, Marian. So these concepts are very important and they influence us. So biases are very strong in this. So would you then conclude, would you recommend our listeners and viewers to consume less media, besides, of course, your own articles?
As a journalist, you can't possibly say that. But on the other hand, if once you finish reading the New York Times or listening to CNN, turn over and click on to Reason. You'll find a lot of good information there.
And you know, also as libertarians, I think it's very difficult for me to tell somebody, you know, you shouldn't do X, Y, and Z. I would appeal to your viewers' self-interest, which is to say, if something is making you very unhappy, then for goodness sake, change your behavior. Right. We know that Twitter operates in a very interesting psychological way. It every time you share something and you receive a positive feedback, it actually releases dopamine in your brain, which is the hormone that give us a feel good rush. So there are ways in which we are being hooked onto social media, but once you are aware of these negativity biases, and once you are aware of the ways in which Twitter, for example, hooks you in, then you can do something about it and regulate your access and your exposure to news and to Twitter and to Facebook, and do something better with your time.
Right. Stop doom scrolling.
Unfortunately, empirical evidence shows that if you induce anger or outrage as an emotion, that gets shared much more. But on the positive side, if you have something that is inducing hope, like your book and this very webinar, that hopefully will also get shared much more. So please, folks, go out there and share it as a little segue there. And that is a good insights. But if you had to choose, you have analyzed, I think, 74 trends in your book, and you study many more. What would you say, for you personally, what is the most optimistic trend for humankind?
Anyone to start in specific?
You go ahead, Marian. I have to pick one.
You have to pick one.
Okay.
Well, because Ron is a dear friend of mine, I would say life expectancy.
Is that a clever way of saying you're old? Thank you, Marian.
Sounds a little bit like that, yes.
Look, life expectancy is the most important thing because everything else is irrelevant if you are not around. Rich people 100 years ago could expect to live to about 50. Those were the richest people in the world. Today, the global average is 72. In the United States, is 78. In Japan and outliers, it's longer than that. I think it's the most important one. I don't know if it's my favorite. I have a lot of favorites, but yeah, I think life expectancy is the most important one.
I'm going to go, and I thank you, Marian, for wishing me longevity. As a transhumanist, I'm really planning on it, but we'll see. I guess my favorite one would be the end of poverty, if I have to pick one, and that's the flip side of the great enrichment. Essentially, what we demonstrate is if you look at long-term trends, about 1820 or so, the 90% of the world lived in what is called absolute poverty, and absolute poverty is less than $2 a day per person on planet Earth. And it was 90% of all of our ancestors lived basically without light, heat. I mean, it was terrible, horrible. And over that period of time, it took 160 years for that to drop down to only 40% around 1980. It took 160 years for poverty to be essentially, absolute poverty, the lowest level of poverty measured by the World Bank, to be reduced to 40%, to be cut in half, essentially. And since then, it's now below 10%. It's the last numbers we have are 8.5%. It may tick up because of the COVID problem now, but it certainly won't be going back to 40%, anywhere close to that. And the trend will continue. So what basically lifting people out of poverty is, it gives them all the other good things that we point to in the book: longevity, health, education, opportunity, even happiness. And those things are absolutely critical. So the flip side, and what we're trying to do with the poverty measurement, is also to point out, a lot of people say, well, the great enrichment, a lot of, the top 1% got all the gains. The fact of the matter is that at every level that we show of income, the gains, and that this is what the end of poverty means, is that it was actually distributed very widely across humanity over the last 200 years. So that would be, if I'm forced to pick one, my favorite.
I love those answers, but are you concerned that that might change? Because both of the indicators you have given, to some extent or to a very large extent, depend on the health of the economy. But we see recently in decades that we need to accumulate more and more debt to create much less and less growth. Right. And so we see the debt levels across the world rising, and Jeff Booth in his book Price of Tomorrow is also writing about that, and so do many other intelligent folks. Are you concerned about the debt levels that the world is seeing, or you think that we will just productively outgrow that?
No, I personally am worried about that. But again, looking at the long-term trends, as horrible as the 1930s were and the Great Depression, on long-term trends that we show in the book again, that was a blip. It was obviously ended up with a lot of bad things happening subsequent to it, not least was the Second World War and the rise of communism. But on the other hand, if you look at the blip, it is a blip on the long-term trend of rising prosperity over time. So yes, we may be in for some rough times in the next decade or so, but I believe this too shall pass.
I'm also concerned. The most widely accepted research on this is Rogoff and Reinhardt's book, which seems to identify very high levels of debt with reduction in growth. Certainly, there is a potential for us to face the Japanification of the United States and Western Europe. This is not only bad for our standard of living, but it seems that also people tend to have fewer babies, and they don't feel optimistic about the future and things like that, which in itself is a problem. But even though we do have very irresponsible politicians who do these sorts of things, there are also, on the other side of the ledger, ways in which we can improve our economic growth, even when debt is very high, which is to say that we can, for example, deregulate to allow companies and corporations and smart people to apply their minds to generate more economic growth. So even at the time of high debt, it is not impossible to stimulate growth through correct policies. But if you do combine very high debt rates with socialist policies, then of course it's a double whammy.
And that's sustainable. Many different countries have tried that, including Sweden, and they had to reform their system, and many others. And we see once they're opening up, then growth returns. But
well, that's we should take heart from the Swedish example. They went far down that path, and then they reversed course. I believe that we will be able to do that here as well.
I certainly hope so. And most people don't know about it. They think like Sweden is the socialist paradise. But in the 1980s, yes, they might have been, but it was not a paradise. It was very unsustainable debt levels, a lot of unemployment. Government could not produce any basic services. And then they had to really open it up. There was much more competition within the markets. They were able to cut some of the entitlements that they've created over the last previous decades. And then Sweden became like much better and a much more modern welfare state that they have now compared to like...
I want to add just a couple of things about Sweden. One is that until the 1960s, Swedish government spending, the size of government in Sweden was roughly equivalent to that in the United States. Yeah. Swedish experiment with socialism lasted only during the late 1970s and the 1980s, and it ended up in a massive financial crisis of 19 and 91. Yeah. So once again, as Mrs. Thatcher used to say, socialists ran out of other people's money. And since then, Sweden has had a relatively good economic policy. Its trade is freer than ours in the United States. Its job market and many other things are lightly regulated. So it's a capitalist economy with a substantially higher level of redistribution. But it is a free market economy, very similar to the United States.
Actually, better.
In some ways.
In some ways, yeah. Very good. So what have you identified for you personally? What would you consider the biggest threat against these more positive trends that you've identified in your book? What would that be?
So here we are, negativity bias on display here from Wolf. Okay. I actually do have one, and this is one I am concerned about, is I'm worried about the development of a social credit surveillance state, similar to what China is being able to do. Basically, the technologies of surveillance are getting to be very, very good. Facial recognition technology with cameras everywhere, watching people. Plus, in China, you get your social credit score. It's tied to your ID. And if you're doing something the state doesn't like, they give you demerits, and the more demerits you get, the less you have access to services. I mean, services like getting a train ticket on a fast train, you can be denied that. Your kids can't go to the good schools, et cetera, et cetera. And then sort of the real genius of it is you get demerits if you hang out with people who have low social credit scores. So either you go to your friends and say, get your score up, or I won't talk to you anymore. And so basically you create a coercive mechanism among people to regulate themselves using this gamification, if you will, of totalitarianism. So I'm very worried about that technology spreading across the world. And my particular concern with the United States is that we've created, if you will, a private surveillance state. Essentially, all the big tech companies watch us all the time. Facial recognition is getting better. We have cameras increasingly everywhere. And I have this fear that we might have a moment where the government uses a crisis like the attacks on 9/11 to go to these companies and demand access to all of their information on all of us. And so we might have a case, which I hope not, of a turnkey totalitarianism based on private surveillance having aggregated this data that the government would then seize. So that's a concern, but read the book anyway. The trends are good. And
it's good to be aware of these things so we can continue to be optimistic, so we're keeping those developments in check. And I 100% agree with you, because my PhD thesis was actually about the growth of laws after recessions, so during crises. And what I found is that laws get enacted quicker after crisis, which is intuitive because something has to get done, unfortunately. But laws also grow in size 10 times in average in terms of like length of those laws. That's what I found empirically. And I can promise all of you that those laws are not the most thoughtful ones and not the ones that necessarily will help the solution. And we can see this with all sorts of crises. And if I may add one more thing to what you said, Juan, if you pair the citizen score with now the emergence of central bank digital currencies, then you can also control all of the flow of money and where that goes. So that is, and China is experimenting with that right now. They just rolled out like the first, like their digital currency in some areas in China, and that's really worrisome. So that's something we need to look out for. But Marian, I don't want to cut you off. So what is your most worrisome trend?
In terms of threats to humanity and to progress and to civilization, well, it very much depends on your time scale. I mean, eventually the sun will swell up and devour our earth and that sort of thing. But of the things that we can do something about, the omnipresent danger to humanity is the presence of nuclear weapons. We are seeing an erosion of the non-nuclear, or rather nuclear reduction treaties in the last, really in the last decade or so. And the numbers of nuclear warheads and the technology, such as hypersonic missiles and things like that, that's sort of creeping up, back up again. And we should be moving in the opposite direction. I don't think we'll ever live in a world without nuclear weapons, because once you have that information and technology, it cannot be forgotten. But we could aim for a world where there will be so few nuclear weapons that even if they all go off by accident, it will not destroy humanity. And that is perhaps where we should be heading. And that's something that we can do something about. And it's also the most dangerous threat out there that we know of. We didn't know about COVID, but we do know about nukes.
Well, thank you for that. Not to give in too much of the negativity bias, but we got a question here from a gentleman called Zach. He asks, especially in the light of nuclear powers, but what about the rise of nationalism around the world? And he mentioned specifically like Trump and Boris and so forth, Boris Johnson, I presume he refers to. Is that something that should affect our optimism about the world, or how do you think about nationalism generally and the rise of that?
Who do you want to answer? Well, look, Ron and I didn't discuss this at length, But my own view, I certainly don't want to put Trump and Boris Johnson in the same boat. What happened in Britain was very different than what's been happening in the United States. The Brits were part of an international organization that they didn't want to be a part of. So I don't think that the two should be put in the same boat. Look, there has always been a bit of a tension between liberalism and nationalism, and the kind of structures that are necessary for the improvement of human well-being, such as international trade and so forth. Even now, there's probably going to be some retraction from globalization. We are probably going to start making a lot more stuff at home, things like vaccines and antibiotics and things like that. That's probably unavoidable, but we just must make sure that the snapback is not too great, because we do know what happened in the 1930s during the Smoot-Hawley Act and things like that.
Mm-hmm. The other thing I always like to cite the insights of Friedrich Hayek on this. Is basically he pointed out in the Fatal Conceit, also constitutional liberty and so forth, that that the evolved psychological nature of human beings is essentially to be sort of tribalistic and collectivist, and that in fact was what maintained, if you will, a certain way of human living back in the evolutionary environment. And then the First Nation states were essentially organized as giant families with a father figure called a king or a chieftain at the top and so forth. And that the breakthrough that occurred 2 centuries ago was getting to create a larger extended order of the rule of law, where the rules of the family, the collective, were not what governed people's choices in the world. And that was part of the liberal revolution. And as Hayek made the point, is that we're always going to be at war. Those of us who are classical liberals who are arguing for a more cosmopolitan, open, tolerant world, we will always be at war and defending those values and those institutions against the evolved tribalistic nature of people. So I see these things as if you will, reversions back to our evolved nature. But I think the institutions that we do have of liberalism are strong enough eventually to overwhelm that nature and lead us again to a more prosperous and freer future.
Part of the reason why it is important to understand where humanity is relative to its past, as Ron said in the first answer, is that it will make you appreciate the social and the economic, or the political and the economic underpinnings of modernity. Once you understand how extraordinarily unusual in human history the last 200 years are, then logically you need to figure out for yourself what has happened, what has changed in human history that has enabled the last 200 years to come about. And my view is, and I think Ron's view is, that it was basically a representative government and free market economics, or rather economic liberalization, both at home and internationally. So that's the importance of, that's why study of history is so incredibly important. I know it's a truism to say that, or rather maybe it's a trivial thing to say that people should know more about the past, but they do, because we are a species that's 300,000 years old, and modernity amounts to 0.08% of our time on Earth. That's how new it is. And that is why we need to appreciate the reasons why it happened.
And at the risk of recommending someone else's writing, of course, everyone here will buy multiple copies of our book, but Frank Fukuyama has a nice piece on liberalism in a new magazine called American Purpose. And if you're interested, Frank and I have had some disagreements on a lot of issues, we'll just say, but on this one, I think he's largely right. So I think that a lot of people might benefit from reading this particular essay on liberalism that he has, again, at a new magazine called American Purpose.
Those were some excellent points, and I think one could also summarize some of what has been said as like one has to ask the question about not about what creates poverty, but what actually creates prosperity.
Exactly.
And once you go down that rabbit hole, quickly people will learn that authoritarianism or any kind of very centralized government structure will not lead to that. And unfortunately, sometimes human beings learn very slowly and sometimes painfully slow, but there's always hope for that.
The perfect example currently right now, of course, is Venezuela, which was one of the richest countries in the world in the middle of this century, and is now the average per capita income is below that of Haiti.
Very true. And then another question that I had for you is, since a lot of people make predictions about the future of the world all the time, and I think we're running out of oil has been predicted like 50 times or so. So what are your favorite predictions about the doomsday scenarios from the past that our listeners and viewers should know about?
One of my jokes is that I make my living going back and reminding people of what they said in the past, and they really, really hate that. No one likes that. I've written whole books on this particular topic. The other one was, most recent one was the End of Doom, where I rehearse a lot of these particular doomsday predictions. And I always point out that, as Marian pointed out, I'm of a certain age, which means that I had the opportunity of going to college when the population bomb by Paul Ehrlich was current. It was 1968, where he said that hundreds of millions of people are going to starve to death in the 1970s, despite any programs that might be embarked upon now. The Limits to Growth came out in 1972, and which basically said we would be out of oil, natural gas, gold, copper and zinc and so forth before the year 2000. And all of these books were being taught me as an undergraduate at the University of Virginia at the time. And basically I thought my future was doomed and miserable, and that, I'd barely make it to 40. Sometime later in my life, I was working as a staff writer at Forbes magazine, and I looked up, and this is the late 80s, and I'm going, we're still here. And, it looks pretty good. And so I went to my editor at Forbes at the time, the genius Jim Michaels, and said, what I'd like to do is go back and reread all these books and then do a series of articles for Forbes about what happened. In my naive confidence, I thought, great, I'll call up Paul Ehrlich, ask him, aren't you, what happened? And I thought he would go, God, I'm so relieved, Ron. We didn't have overpopulation. The famines didn't occur. No. What Paul told me was, and this was about 1990, when we were talking, he said, Ron, I got my timing wrong. I go, so you said the famines are still coming? And he goes, yes. And I said, well, when are we going to expect, the famines with hundreds of millions of people dying? And Paul told me, well, it's going to happen between the year 2000 and the year 2010. We all remember the great famines of 2025, right? I mean, 2005. And then, I went up to MIT and talked to the people who did the Limits to Growth, that we're going to run out of things. And I spent the day with the book, and it was underlined, and asked them, well, what about this? And finally, the guy who did the computer program, a guy named Forrester, turned to me and said, all right, Ron, we probably overemphasized the material resources side of things. I'm like, well, you should tell the New York Times that, because in 1972, it was on the front page that we were all doomed because we're going to run out of things. So, those basically, none of these predictions came true. The world just has become better. Resources, as Marian will be more than happy to point out to you, as a great chapter on this, are getting cheaper all the time. And longevity increases. In fact, population is, as we point out in the book, peak population is in sight. My generation saw the last doubling of human population ever. The younger members of people who are watching this will never see that happen again. And world population will probably peak somewhere shy of 9 billion in the middle of the century and be back down to about what it is now, current trends continuing. So those are my two favorites. We're running out of everything, and we're all going to die of famine. Didn't happen.
Yeah, I'm only going to add that in my lifetime, I am now in my 40s. In my lifetime, I remember things like we were certainly worried about expanding deserts. Sahara was supposed to have consumed basically everything, whereas in fact, Sahara is now shrinking. Other things that we were worried about, let's see, Y2K bug. At the turn of the millennium, all the clocks and all the computers were supposed to have stopped, and nuclear weapons were supposed to have exploded spontaneously. So that didn't happen. What else? We were worried about acidifying rain. There was certainly a lot of talk about that. Nuclear weapons and nuclear war was certainly present until the late 1980s, the early 1990s. I mean, our generation and Ron's and previous ones had to worry about a nuclear conflict, and that right now, at least for the time being, has subsided. Mad cow epidemics. I mean, that was something which was supposed to have wiped out millions of people. So those were the sorts of things that occupied us in the 80s and the 90s.
One thing I would also say, whenever I feel slightly down, and occasionally, even though I claim to be an optimist, I occasionally have moments of despair, I remind myself, but the Soviet Union is gone. That is one of the most amazing facts of history. It just disappeared. The Soviet Empire just went away, and hardly anyone died from it. So that was an amazing accomplishment for humanity as well. But I think you should ask Marian about his chapter on resources. It's really fabulous work he's been doing. He has a new book coming out on it too.
Marian, may I ask about that? Please go ahead.
It's very kind of you. A subtle push for my next book. Look, one of the this is still an issue. Believe it or not, even though what Ron said is absolutely true, which is that population is going to peak in the 60s and the 70s, and then it's going to decline. A lot of people still believe that we have too many people on Earth, and even if we don't, people will still consume too much stuff, and therefore things are not going to end well. In my research, we discovered that for every 1% increase in population, we get 1% decrease in the price of natural resources. And that's because human mind, not to get too religious, but with every hungry mouth, God sends a pair of hands and a brain, which is to say that human beings are the primary producers of ideas, if not the sole producers of ideas. And it is ideas which contribute to technical, scientific, and medical progress. It is ideas which allow us to subsidize, or rather to substitute one type of commodity for another. So we no longer have to slaughter whales in order to produce candles to read at night. Now we can plug our lamps or our computers to a grid which is powered by nuclear energy or natural gas or what have you, and so we are not running out of resources. In fact, resources are becoming cheaper. Our newest research goes back all the way to 1850, and in all of the cases that we found, things are substantially cheaper. One last thing I want to talk about, and that is dematerialization. Which is to say that it is not necessarily true that because we are all getting richer, or will be, hopefully, when COVID is gone, and we consume more stuff, it doesn't necessarily mean that we are going to need more resources. And that is because of this economic concept called dematerialization. And that's essentially that this little thing, the iPhone, allows us, or rather it combines into it a lot of things which are previously independent appliances. So for example, it is a map, it is a notepad, it is a camera, it is a flashlight, and all sorts of other things. So we could be seeing a future where we get more and more stuff, but using less and less resources, and that would be very exciting. It's already happening in the United States and in the United Kingdom, where we are producing more GDP for less resources. But if this happens in other economies as they become more sophisticated, then really Earth has infinite amount of resources and we are not going to destroy it.
Right. We're not going to run out of ideas to make better recipes for making things. And interestingly, Marian, you probably don't know this, but I was looking up for something else I was writing, new research from Arnulf Grubler, whose work we cite on dematerialization. He has a new paper out that we couldn't include in the book, unfortunately, where he lays out scenarios for what the world might look like in 2050. And one that is not at all ridiculously optimistic, a very reasonable scenario. Humanity currently uses somewhere around 100 gigatons of stuff, food, metals, minerals, fuel, that kind of thing. Humanity supports itself on 100 gigatons of stuff every year. He thinks that with a richer and more populous world by 2050, it could be down to 83 gigatons, a reduction of almost 20% over that period of time. Again, because we're getting better at using stuff over time. We get more value from less stuff all the time. So in fact, we will be, and I confidently believe this, and we have other data showing this, that humanity will in fact be withdrawing from nature, leaving more space for the other species on the planet to flourish over the course of the coming century.
And humanity is always on the lookout to preserve resources and to save resources. Because of course, the more resources you use as an input, the more expensive the output. In the 1950s and 1960s, if you wanted to prove that you were macho, you would squeeze a Coke can or a beer can in one hand. And why was that an example of strength? Is because the Coke can back then was made from much more aluminum than today. I think it was like, I can't remember exactly, but those were thick cans made from aluminum, and it really took a lot of strength to do that. Now even a child can do it because through technological progress, we now can make many more cans of soda from 1 pound of aluminum than we could in the 1950s or 1960s. Why did that happen? It's because Coca-Cola didn't want to pay too much for aluminum. They want to produce as many aluminum cans out of a pound of aluminum as they possibly can.
Excellent points. Really interesting. And Charles is asking in chat right now, we have been discussing some of the trends that didn't come to fruition, some of the predictions, and some of them are very entertaining, and it's good for us to be aware of them. My favorite one that I don't think you have added is that I think around the 1910s or so, people, because they had more and more access to horse carriages, so people were very much concerned that they would like be in 2 feet out of horse manure in the cities because there were so many horse carriages around. Which is like 60 centimeters for people who use a decent measurement system. And that of course didn't take place because cars came about and so forth. So it's hysterical to sometimes look back. But what about the reverse? Charles is asking about the people who have made these predictions that are actually much more closer to what you have found in your book. Who is doing that these days, or from the last 2 decades or so?
Do you need more people than Marian and me?
That was Charles's question. Don't blame me for it. Don't blame me for it.
There are a number of people, and in fact, if you go to the book, you'll find a lot of them have endorsed our book. Of course, Marian and I are working in the tradition of the great Julian Simon. He was one of the first people to challenge the doom and gloom of the mid 20th century and fight against people like Ehrlich and the limits to growth folks. He wrote a wonderful book called The Resourceful Earth in that period of time, pointing out a lot of the positive trends and most of his predictions, by the way, have come true. He famously made a bet with Paul Ehrlich on 5 metals, starting in 1980. And Ehrlich basically was saying, we have to get a lot of people in on this because we're going to make a ton of money off of this guy, Julian, because obviously the prices of zinc and copper and so forth are going to go way up over the next decade. In 1990, he sent a check without a note, by the way, to Julian. I was a friend of Julian's, saying for $567 and I think 78 cents. In other words, the price of the metals chosen by Ehrlich himself had gone down more than 50% in value over that period of time. But currently other people writing, and I'll let Marian speak quickly, but of course, as our good friend, Matt Ridley, who wrote The Rational Optimist in his new book on innovation. but there are many others. Marian, take it away.
Just out of interest, this month is exactly 40 years since the start of the Ehrlich-Simon wager. Those of your viewers who don't know about the wager, please look it up on Wikipedia or elsewhere. It was quite an extraordinary thing, because Julian went against the current, and he was alone, or almost alone, and that really takes a lot of courage. At least Ron and I can rely on a group of intellectual brothers, if you will, and perhaps even sisters. The brothers include people like Steven Pinker from Harvard, whose book Enlightenment Now I highly recommend. Then we have Johan Norberg, a Swedish economist and writer. He writes about these things, and he writes very well. I'm sure I'm forgetting some people, but Ridley, Norberg, and Pinker are the people that I go to when I have difficult questions, along with Ron, of course.
Excellent. And of course, Simon's very famous book is The Ultimate Resource, and The Ultimate Resource too, for folks who want to read that book, where he makes the case that Marian also made very eloquently regarding that it's about the human mind that is the most finite resource. And besides the human mind, you don't need much else, because we will try to figure out our problems. Now, some people disagree with that, and I think many people would say that one of the most pressing problems humanity is facing right now is climate change, and that we need a lot of resources in order to tackle that. And there's, of course, a lot of doomsday scenarios around that. How do you tackle this topic, and are you optimistic about it? Will we see mass famines and a lot of floodings and more storms and all of this? Or do you think that there is a glimmer of hope somewhere in that discussion as well? Maybe Marian, maybe you want to start with that.
I'll ping this one to Ron.
I wanted to change this. I wanted to change the sequence a little bit so that you don't.
You'll find out why he wanted me to do that very shortly. Years I have been because of my experience in writing at Forbes and so forth in my first book, which was called Eco Scam, I was quite skeptical when the climate change issue became live. I actually was someone who attended the Earth Summit in Rio, where the UN Treaty on Climate Change, the first one, was negotiated. And I've been following the issue now for over 30 years fairly closely. And I was initially very skeptical. It sounded like most of the other environmental scares that I've been dealing with. But slowly but surely, the data came in, and I changed my mind. I've decided around 2005 that it could become a significant problem for humanity. And what I want to put it in the context of is I'm going to make a bold statement. Anything that anyone out there thinks is an environmental problem, that problem is occurring in an open access commons. It's a resource that is not owned by anyone, not protected by anyone. And so if if the river's polluted, it's because no one owns it. No one can prevent people from throwing trash into it. If a forest is being burned down, alas, 80% of the world's forests are in fact owned by governments, and this should scare us to death. If a fishery is overfished, it's because no one owns it. And the atmosphere is the same way. So basically we are adding carbon dioxide chiefly to the atmosphere, and that is increasing the average temperature on the planet. It will be, given the complexity of the issue, I'm fully, and I've just contributed to a book from the Hoover Institution on adaptation and the use of markets to solving problems like this. And since the temperatures are going to go up, humanity is going to have to both adapt to it and then try to mitigate it in some ways as well. It's a long topic. If anyone is particularly interested, you could go to Reason, and I have a very, I think, comprehensive analysis of the science and also the if you will, the policies that might ameliorate it. Ultimately, though, I don't think it's an existential crisis. It'll be something that humanity will be able to adapt to, and it's not an immediate thing. We're not going to fall off a cliff. When you hear someone say, we only have 10 years to save the planet, that's actually based on a UN report that basically says, well, if you wanted to keep the temperature below an increase of 1.5 degrees centigrade over the next century, you'd have to do this and such. There's no cliff we're going to fall off of in 2030. It's simply going to get a bit warmer. The thing is, if people will be retreating from the sea coast, we should, for example, not be supplying subsidized flood insurance to Americans so that they can build expensive houses on the sea coasts and then have the taxpayers pay for the damages that occur and those kinds of things. But no, it is a problem. And if I were forced to come up with one solution, period, I would be in favor of a revenue neutral carbon tax, and I would eliminate all other regulations on energy use and supply, period. No CAFE standards, no emission standards, no nothing, just a revenue neutral carbon tax. But I am not, unfortunately, world dictator, because I would be a benevolent one. And so that doesn't seem very likely. Humanity will muddle through, and the world will be a better place in 2100 in any case, though a bit warmer.
Part of the reason why I pinged it to Ron is because he simply thought about this subject much more than I have, which is very good reason to give it to him. But just looking at the numbers from my perspective, I don't think that subsidization of solar panels or windmills and things like that is the way to go forward. I think that we are spending far too much money doing this. I think that money could be much better spent putting it behind scientific research to create cleaner energy which doesn't contribute to CO2 emissions. Sure. Be it new, more sophisticated filters, which ensure that emissions from gas-fired plants are clean, or be it smaller and safer fission reactors. Putting good money behind a fusion reactor would be also a good idea. I mean, I think it's a better idea. We need to come out of this through a technological solution, not hoping that we are going to persuade people to dramatically reduce their consumption, because energy goes into everything, and people are willing to do a little bit, but they are not willing to repeat what we've had in the last 6 months, which is that the world comes to a halt and there are no CO2 emissions, but all of us are suicidal. That's not the way forward.
No, the idea is, and Marian's absolutely right on this, is to do the research that makes non-carbon energy cheaper than carbon energy. And that would be a brilliant way to spend a few $1 billion.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. This is what you heard here first. You learned a lot about some very good trends about the world, why you should be a little bit more optimistic than you were maybe this morning. And I really appreciate the brilliant insights you've shared with us. You taught us so much about different thinkers, about different trends. And also we have learned that Ron will be running for World King at some point. So if you want to contribute to his campaign, you can find his email, of course, at reason.com. But please, everyone, check out reason.com, check out Human Progress, so that you can follow the great work these gentlemen and their teams are doing. I really appreciate that you are changing the narrative. That's very much narrative, and it's very much needed. And with that being said, I appreciate everyone zooming in or YouTubing in, and I hope you all have a very wonderful day and be more optimistic in the future. Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Bye-bye.